Yo, what up? This is Joel Turner, and we're here chilling out at the Earth and Arts Festival at Nambour. Come check it out.
This is a painting of the Great Barrier Reef to raise awareness for kids my age, so when we're older, the barrier reef will still be as beautiful as it is now.
Hi, I'm Jim. I'm all about awareness, wellness, oneness.
I've got a beautiful curry laksa made by Jimmy. All the love in the world.
This is pure water made out of the atmosphere. Couldn't be better.
So we developed compassionate housing affordability solutions at Mullaney. We've developed a model. It's a model of housing that every community across the coast and Australia can adopt. And we've got our first tiny house being built on the Mullaney Community Garden.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Hurst from Polkadot. We collaborated with a group of great community leaders who work on the environment, the arts, and anything to do with the planet. Some great musicians and artists come through today, and it was a really good affirmation of people's views about being better to the planet and forming community around that. We hope to continue this, do a lot more of these events to try and help teach us all how to make the environment engaging, be something we can think about, but also something we can do something about as well.
Well, welcome. Welcome to the first panel for Saturday. The panel's a really great opportunity to hear from a bunch of different people who've got really good insight for you. The way the panel works, you've got the microphones either side of the room. It's really helpful if you can make your way down to that microphone to speak into that, because it just means everyone hears your question. If you can just say your name, and just like we've done previously, just keep it really short and ask a question rather than kind of take us on a journey, which may be a good journey, but it'll be like one of those stressful journeys where you just don't have the time and you know you're going to miss the gate. So, if you've got a question, that's how it works. I'm going to hand this over to Rikki, who's actually going to help moderate this conversation. Thanks so much, Rikki.
Hi, everybody. We've got a great panel here today. The discussion topic is where can I put my tiny house? I'm going to hand over to the panel members just to introduce themselves, let you know who they are, where they're from, and a little bit about what brought them to this space.
Okay. Yeah, hi, Brian Stockwell. I'm one of the local councillors, but today, if I can have the big disclaimer, my views are my own, not necessarily those of NOOSA Council. How I got to be here, quick potted journey. 1978, I dropped out of uni and became a hippie for about 10 years, where I visited a lot of communities and went to permaculture and organic growing. I became responsible in about 88 when I got into the council the first time, had one term in NOOSA Council then, and then became a planner regional catchment planner ecologist, all through state and local government. So also went into economic development and became a regional director before I got kicked out by Campbell Newman. Set up a consultancy called Watershed Australia. During that time, got up to a PhD in a whole range of issues around sustainability and ecology. And I'm here because I think small housing and affordable housing is really important, as is eco-villages were yesterday.
Good morning, I'm Valerie, ESC Consulting. Been exploring tiny houses for the last couple of years, especially on the planning and building regulatory framework.
Hello, my name's Paul Brandenberg. I come from the construction industry. We're open builders, we're property developers, we have a development management company, we have a tiny house company that builds container houses. The containers that you see in the backyard belong to us. We have a different approach to most of the tiny house builders. We tackle the legislation head on, front on, and we comply with the legislation and deliver a product that's fully compliant. So we've gone down that path, which is a different path to a lot of the tiny house manufacturers that are looking for the loopholes. We just tackle it head on and solve the problems. We have a good team of people, consultants that work for us that solve all the little problems. We're very excited about tiny houses. We agree that the future is in sustainable housing. We deliver a lot of big projects, you know, $100 million housing projects, $100 million, $20 million commercial projects. We just see the market getting squeezed. We look at our own children and we say, how are they ever going to afford a block of land for $300,000, which is some of the prices at the moment? Then you've got to build on it, completely inflexible. And it's just it's a bit of a cookie. There's very limited individualisation of it, and it's expensive. And people are going to live with mortgages for the rest of their lives under the current system. We have had some assistance from government, and there's a willingness. However, you've got big property developers with big money that are pressuring the governments as well to stop any gaps to allow people to deliver sustainable housing. One of the big problems that we see in the development industry is the government taxes on a block of land. It adds to the $300,000 block, the taxes and all the government fees. Of that $300,000, about $72,000 of it is in fees and charges. That is not the land. That is
definitely something that somebody will touch on in the audience. Thank you very much.
My name's Chris Wenban. I'm a tiny house dweller. I'm president of the Australian Tiny House Association. I'm a co-founder of a tiny house building company based down in Victoria, and I've sort of travelled the country. So I've seen tiny houses in WA, in South Australia, in Victoria, in New South Wales, in Queensland, and I've got a little trip to Tasmania booked in. So I think I've seen more tiny houses in Australia than most people.
Mel Sparkles from Tiny Houses Brisbane. Settle.
A lot of love for Mel.
I live in a 22 square metre space at the moment. It was 14 square metres and I've expanded to 22, so I can swing a cat now. I'm all for tiny housing. The median house price in Brisbane was in the 400s last time I checked, and that was for a fairly cheap house. For me, that's completely unaffordable, being single and on a low-income wage. So yeah, I'm definitely all for tiny housing, and I definitely think it's the way forward.
Hi, I'm Heather Shearer. I'm a researcher and a lecturer at Griffith University. I started researching tiny houses about 3 or 4 years ago when I was moving from a house that I was living in, which was in McMansion on the Sunshine Coast. And I was looking for a different house to live in, and I saw tiny houses on social media. And I thought, wow, that's so cool. So I've started researching it since then. I've done a number of research projects on tiny houses, mostly around southeast Queensland, but I've interviewed people all around Australia, and I'm passionate about tiny houses. I now live in a little house. It's not a tiny house, though, but it's not a McMansion either.
Thank you. So, question time. Who's got some questions for this wonderful, diverse panel? Hi, Kylie.
Hello, yes, we've met before. I'm particularly interested in the urban integration of tiny houses, and I just wanted to get people's feedback on some of my observations of older suburbs, blocks of land that were developed to bring up families, so anywhere from 4 to 6 people living in a home. Those homes are now occupied by maybe a single person, older person, or a couple. So the demand of that on the resources of the infrastructure for that house is reduced over the life of that land. Across the road, that house has been redeveloped, and it's a 4-bedroom, 4-bathroom home with a large family, but if you wanted to integrate a tiny house, the council would consider putting huge amounts of dollars onto what would be to pay for future demand on that lot. What I see is the irony that you've got a block with a single person which is actually using less council resources, but the house across the road doesn't have, from my understanding, those same development fees because it's a mainstream house. They've just taken it from an old house to a McMansion. Can you offer some insights on that tricky situation, how councils might be viewing that? I see it as ridiculously unfair myself.
Okay. Brian, would you like to respond to that? Throwing you in the deep end.
It's an interesting prospect, and I think what we have to look at is when we're doing development, we are looking at it from a land use planning perspective, we're looking at the overall impact. But history shows that the castle of each one of us is something that no politician wants to touch. So if you're developing a McMansion, trying to control that currently is very difficult. So for example, all the good stuff that was identified in our current planning scheme is soon to become obsolete. And that's because we've just this last week put on a new planning scheme on display, but we're trying to actually make it easier for small and affordable dwellings. We're actually, if you're putting multiple small 1 to 2 bedroom dwellings onto a property, you're going to have reduced car parking and have more site area you can take up in a residential area. But the particular question you've got is, it depends how you structure it. Is, yes, if you need a planning assessment, then most councils will have an infrastructure charge associated with it. Some councils do look at infrastructure charges in light of social outcomes, but most look at it purely from an engineering perspective. Most, well, in southeast Queensland, you won't have an opportunity but to apply what your water provider says, your water and sewerage provider in this neck of the woods, Community Water. They set the infrastructure charges, council doesn't. We do it on roads, parks and things like that, and that tends to be based on a equivalent population type calculation. But as I said, people's home, their castle tends to be exempt, so there's always going to be some disparity. But the key of the question is, I don't think planners should be encouraging McMansions. I think they should be encouraging the form of development where people stay in their own homes and their backyards turned into accommodation for the next generation or someone who might be able to help look after the aged person in that house.
Thank you, Brian.
Could I just clarify that? It's a lot of good questions you asked there. You've actually got state legislation and local legislation. What the state did in its wisdom 5 years ago is they removed the headworks charges from the council, because what they found was one council was charging one, another council was charging another. So the state clawed back the headworks charges. Now, I've done a lot of work on headworks because we deal with it every day of the week. We've got the best consultants in Queensland that write the legislation for the state government on our team. When that block of land was registered, this is the argument, and there's cases in the court about it now. When that block of land was registered, the headworks were paid on that block of land for the council, okay? Now, that block of land was registered, it wasn't specified a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom house, okay? So it might be a 2-bedroom house. You want to add another bedroom, there should be no more headworks charges. That's the argument, okay? And that's starting to fly with the state government. It's a state government issue. So there's two components to headworks. There's your infrastructure charges, which go to council for their roads and whatnot. It actually goes to state government. It's redistributed through the stream. The other part of headworks is your sewer and water charges, we've mentioned before. when in the government, in the state government, in their wisdom, privatised and took it from council, and they paid council a huge amount of money to buy the water and sewer off them 5 years ago. We've now got we've got Unity Water and the other crowd, whatever they call, and they're running at massive profits. It's a complete rip-off. It's a scam, the whole thing. So what you get charged for is the fixture. So in putting a tiny house or a container in there and it's got a toilet and a shower, it's just a plumbing application, and they gain their approval through Unity Water. So there's a council fee for plumbing compliance. At the moment, I think it's about $800 for one of our container modules. And then there's a further Unity Water fee, which is very grey at the moment, and we're arguing that the Unity Water fee doesn't apply. It's only a plumbing compliance fee with council, because the Unity Water fee was effectively paid when the subdivision was created 50 years ago for that infrastructure. We shouldn't be double paying infrastructure. It's at the moment the lawyers have got their teeth into it, and there's all sorts of arguments going on about it. The council has got a responsibility to stand up from their planning and their legislation and their planning departments and fight for the public, which is, we've already paid for this stuff. We shouldn't be paying for it again.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, we've got a question over here. Malcolm. Welcome,
G'day,
Malcolm.
Mel from Mullaney. If you guys had a magic wand, what is the one thing that you would do to encourage or allow or find locations where you can put a tiny house? What's the one thing? Magic wand.
Okay, one thing. Heather, have you got any thoughts on that?
Thanks for putting me on the spot. I was hoping to go last. Allow people to rent out their backyards to tiny houses.
Yep.
That's probably what I would have said too. But I think like a set of rules to go by, in regards to your plumbing, your power, the way that you conduct your home, where your rubbish is going to go, etc., etc. If there's just a basic guideline around that everyone has to adhere to in a tiny house, I think it's going to make it a lot easier with planning.
And I would just add on to that, allow it, but make it as easy as possible. I think one of the restrictions is that people have to jump through a lot of hoops. Perhaps people on sort of councils and planning departments don't have clear guidelines, which they certainly don't at the moment. So make it easy for people to be able to do something which is actually quite simple.
We need legislation at a state and a local level. We need politicians to stop talking about it and actually do something. And we need to novate it to private certifiers, because the government is too inefficient, they're too slow, and they're too expensive. A certifier, we get a building certified, it may be a $3 million building. The certifier's fees are $1,200 to certify the whole building. If council were doing it, it'd be $12,000. So we've got to get real. We've got to get the legislation to novate the governing of it to private enterprise, so that building certifiers, it's a one-stop shop, there's no red tape, it's quick, it's easy, it's efficient. And the way that we sit, we don't want a denigration of the building code of Australia, because if someone burns in a tiny house, someone's going to go to the big house for a very long time. But under our building codes, if the right mechanisms are put in there to protect the people that are buying a product from a fire, from other things like that, from a plumbing gas leak. So if you get for instance, and these are things that people don't think about, if the plumbing's not done properly, you can get gas, and it's connected to the sewer, gas can come up through the sewer and gas the person in the tiny house. So there's things in place for a reason. It doesn't need to be complicated, but we've got to get down to the core essential things that are needed and move it quick, so it's easy for people and they have a set of rules to comply by for their own safety.
Thank you. Valerie?
I guess my suggestion maybe sounds a little bit trivial, but I guess for me it'll be having that definition within state legislation around tiny houses, because I think from there it should flow down. It should flow down because it will allow councils to really write their planning schemes to account for that type of dwelling, especially if they're really interested in wanting to allow that type of development to take place in their government area. But having it at the state level, I think, is where that definition needs to be, and then it'll just flow down.
Sorry to be a planner too. We're the first council to try and use the new Planning Act to do a new scheme, and we butted heads against the government on the definition of a secondary dwelling, which is we were trying to encourage small housing in the back of people's property. The current definitions for a secondary dwelling says it has to be one household. And we're currently getting legal advice on that, but one of the bits of legal advice we got says to be a household you have to share meals. Why would you put a secondary dwelling with a new kitchen in if you're going to share the meals? So if you're going to go up under the current legislation from a secondary dwelling to a dual occupancy, it can only be a dual occupancy if you want to subdivide. And if you subdivide in places like coastal Noosa, what you get is McMansions, you don't get tiny houses. And so you're actually forcing through the legislation a form of development which is making housing less affordable. So you are encouraging the Airbnb that we heard about in New South Wales. We're actually, I suppose that's another big thing here locally, like many coastal tourism areas. Our new planning scheme is seeking to control short-term accommodation in most of our suburbs, because the competition between affordable housing and short-term tourist housing is immense across the world and growing bigger. It's forcing land prices up, and it's making rental accommodation very difficult. So those, of my one thing, I've got two. Define secondary dwellings so they don't have to be one household, so you can have an unrelated person in the backyard under the Queensland legislation. And two, make sure that there's state controls on Airbnb for visitor accommodation in suburbs.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, great. Hi.
My name is Neil. My question is this one: where can I put a tiny house? As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from around here, but I've been in NOOSA for the last year and a half visiting, and I'd love to have a base here. And I've spoken to people here this morning, and they said if I were to find a block of land that somebody else is already owning and has a house on, that all they need to do is in NOOSA to apply for an extension, and that would allow a tiny home to be located on their property, and then I would lease that space from them. I want it to be 100% legal. Is that the ideal template for putting a tiny home on an existing property that's owned by somebody else?
Great. Brian?
I talked yesterday about the opportunities for pavilion houses and exploded houses, where you can connect a whole lot of different living areas to a main single dwelling. And providing you don't want your own kitchen and your own laundry, yes, it's a very good model. As soon as your house has a kitchen and a laundry, it becomes another dwelling unit, and therefore that's where you trigger all those definitions I was just talking about. But in NOOSA we actually encourage secondary dwellings, and the smaller your dwelling, the more existing lots in the Shire it'll be suitable for, because basically your ability to do it based on boundary setbacks, etc., so you're not affecting the neighbours to any great extent.
There is one complexity to that with tiny houses. When you go down that route, you have to build a tiny house to the Building Code of Australia, the NCC. It was Building Code of Australia, it's now the National Construction Code. It has to comply with the BCA, with the code. A lot of tiny houses do not comply with code. So if you go and get an approval to put that there, that building, that structure, must comply with the code. It must be built by a registered builder. It must be built by a licensed tradesman. It's the same as extending your house, because you're falling within the realms. The track that you're mentioning is the track that we go down. So we don't look, we tackle it head on and go, right, it's an extension to the house, it's a secondary dwelling. Just in relation to, you keep mentioning about NOOSA Council being proactive and being forward thinking, they're not actually. Sydney Council is, I'm just being real. Sydney Council are Sydney Council are 10 years ahead of you. If you go to Sydney Council, you can put the secondary dwelling in your backyard with the laundry, with the kitchen in it. Because what Sydney did was they realised we've got all these blocks of land, we need to increase density, we're spreading out. And when there's all this capacity within the infrastructure that we got to avoid building new roads, to avoid moving into the to the neighbouring, you know, expanding the city and making our transport problems a logistical nightmare. So the Sydney Council, right now, and we had a lot of inquiry on this, that you can pick up one of our modules, got a kitchen, laundry, everything in it, bathroom, and legally you can put it into a Sydney block. So they are 10 years ahead of Sunshine Coast.
That's, yeah, it does differ from state to state. It definitely differs from locality
So
to locality.
we've got to be real about things. We
Yep.
can't, I won't sit here and hear statements that we're forward thinking, because we're not, because we've got to get on top of this. And it's pretty straightforward. This is the easiest thing to legislate and get right. It's so easy, it's not funny. However, when you deal with government, the wheels turn so slow. They've got to have a committee meeting, we've got to do this. When 9 months later, you get a discussion paper, which everyone has a comment on. The big problem that council has is other houses in the street, okay? Because there's this argument that because they want to do a tiny house in the backyard, my amenity, which I paid for effectively through my house price, has been diminished. That's the big problem. The logistics of the legislation of how to do it, it's already there. The framework's already there. You can pull it together so quick it's not funny. The dilemma for council, and this is votes, right? The dilemma for council is that if they put that in place tomorrow, which they could do with the click of their fingers, it's all there. They're not reinventing. The wheel's already invented. That dilemma they have is that the people on the other side of the road that don't like tiny houses, don't want a tiny house, they're saying, there's 2 cars parked on the footpath now, I can hear them playing their music, my density is increased, right, by virtue of the tiny house. That's the big hurdle.
Thank you. Heather, you've also got something to add?
No, I just wanted to make a brief comment that Council's definition of a kitchen requires a proper stove to be attached through the electricity, so if you've just got an induction plate and a toaster oven, it's not counted as a kitchen.
Can I?
Which is what some councils.
Sorry, I've actually been on the court case fighting a council about the definition of a kitchen, and what we have to be aware of going forward is the Planning Act has actually now defined a kitchen, and it said a food preparation area. It doesn't actually say anything. So we've just come across this in the last... As I said, we're the first council going up against the new Planning Act. We've just had a case in the last month, and very clearly, it used to be that anything that you used to be able to find in a motel wasn't a kitchen, and that you'd have some sort of permanent cooking facility, but now it's, unfortunately, I think, through state legislation, made it very broad.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. Mel, did you want to respond as well?
Yeah, with tiny houses, you can be on the road in your tiny house and live legally, so there's no rules and regs about whether you can live in it or not. You can live in the Noosa Shire in a caravan or a tiny house. I'm not sure how long it is for, but so that's just on wheels. You can live in Fremantle in Western Australia in a tiny house. And I don't know if I said it, Brisbane City Council. So you can live legally in your tiny house. It's just when you want to, put roots down, you might want to go and check with your council whether they're happy with that or not.
Mel, I'm actually curious, it's a bit of a question for myself. Because of the uncertainty around the rules and regulations, but people's desire to still live in particularly tiny houses on wheels, how do people navigate through that, through that uncertain terrain?
I've heard there's a document floating around to present to your council to ask all the relevant questions to see if they're okay with having a tiny house in their shire. I can't find the document. If anyone knows where it is, bring it on. But yeah, to my knowledge, you would just have to approach your council with the setup that you've got, because they'd want to know whether you've got a composting toilet that's an approved composting toilet, or whether you're going to be digging a hole in the yard or whatever. So I think it's important that you go armed to the council with all the information about your home, rather than just rock up 3 months later and let them know you're living there and, then possibly get kicked out.
Yep, thank you. Any further questions? Sorry, yep. Oh, a couple of questions down here, yep.
Hi, my name's Danny. My question's actually for Valerie, and even though I've been really enjoying what you're talking about at the moment, you made a comment re-proposal, so even if something is an approved use, that you still need to put in a proposal towards the council for that. I just wanted some clarity on that. I always thought if it's an approved use, you actually don't need to apply. It's an approved use.
So the planning legislation defines 3 types of developments. Accepted, what are the definitions? Basically. So there's a type of application and it's each council determines what they are, where it's accepted development. So if you meet that criteria, you don't need a development application, it's all good. There's another type which
code and impact.
Code accessible, which means you need to put in a development application to show how you're ticking off against the code.
Okay.
And if you manage to do that, then that should be fine. If you can't meet the code, then you become impact accessible and you have to provide a lot of supporting documentation.
Okay, so you have to meet all 3, so it's not just the one.
No. So the planning schemes will actually identify for you what is accepted, what's code, and what's impact.
Okay.
You just got to dig into very boring text to actually work that out. But it's.
And you need to look at the particular zone that you're wanting to put your development in as well.
Okay, thanks.
You don't want impact because then it actually also has to be open to public consultation. So if anyone doesn't like you, then anyone can put in a complaint.
Okay, we've got another question down here. So one more question, sorry. And one more minute left. One more minute. If you do have any other questions that haven't been able to be answered during this panel session, please feel free to come up and talk to the panel members afterwards. But we'll just take one more question. Needs to be quick though.
Sure. I'm Annie. My partner and I are planning on putting a tiny house on wheels in the Sunshine Coast Council area, and we're a bit nervous about being challenged by the council because we know a lot of the rules are, there's the camping one and a temporary one, but I wondered if you guys knew of any cases where people have negotiated with the council successfully if the council have decided to take them on. About that, what do you do if the council suddenly go, move? Yeah.
So this is essentially the case that we had with Lara and her tiny house with Brisbane City Council, where the council, and we think the council was alerted to their situation by a neighbour, but the council came around, looked at their setup and went, looks like you're here permanently, you're going to need a building permit, which it was not possible for them to get a building permit because they had a loft and they were just not going to be able to meet the requirements. But we were able to demonstrate that it was a movable dwelling, it was not there permanently and therefore not subject to the building regulations.
Sorry, we're just going to have to wrap it up. We've just run out of time for this session, but we can have a chat with you afterwards about some of the conversation we had with Sunshine Coast Regional Council after this session. I'd really like to thank all of our panel members, and if you do have any further questions, come and talk to people afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.